Yeah, hi everyone. It's really lovely to be in this space with you all. Um, yeah, happy solstice. As an image description of myself, I am a non-binary femme with light brown skin, African heritage being with short hair. I'm wearing a green shirt and a black and white keffiyeh, and there are some plants behind me. Yeah, really glad to be here this evening in this digital container. It always feels important for me to try and gather with community in some way at these times of the year, such as solstice, when there's a kind of moment to reflect, take stock of what's moving in us and what's moving in the collective, and sort of assess commitments and intentions and maybe some things that need to shed. At least that's what it brings up for me. So I'm really grateful to have witnessed and been part of the beautiful offering so far. So thank you to everyone who's made this happen and for all of you being here. Yeah, I'm hoping that this gathering can help us to clarify more what we care about and how we can, within our capacity, take steps towards the futures or ways of living that our hearts long for. I hope that during this talk for the next half an hour or so, you can give yourself permission to be as you are in this moment and to bring some softness or compassion to wherever you find yourself. This is a time of deep change and unraveling, and it's asking a lot of us all. So I'd really invite you to just follow whatever feels generative and supportive for your body during this talk. If that means stretching, hydrating, doing whatever feels good for you, I just invite you to follow that. And yeah. And before going any further into some content, I'm actually going to invite another short resourcing moment, little short embodiment practice. It was so gorgeous to start with the practice earlier, led by Jackie. It was gorgeous. I'm just going to offer another moment to just pause and notice where we are after this gorgeous content that's been shared already. So this will just be a 3 to 5 minute practice. It's going to be similar to a body scan. I'll be inviting you to find a place in your body that feels most pleasant or neutral. So if you feel like you'd want to participate in that, feel free. But if you'd like to do something else to care for your body right now, please follow that. If you would like to give this a go with me, then I'd invite you to find a comfortable position for your body in this moment. I'd invite you to close your eyes if that feels good, or you can gently rest your gaze somewhere in your space. I'd invite you to begin by just noticing any sensations moving in your body or your mind. I'd invite you to notice any places where your body feels supported right now. This could be the soles of your feet against the floor if you're sat down, or maybe somewhere along your back, or the back of your legs or your hips, maybe connecting with the chair. Just noticing any places where there's connection and support. And then I invite you to scan your body and find a place that feels most pleasant right now without you having to do anything to it. A place that maybe just feels a little bit better than other parts of the body in this moment. And if you're someone that's experiencing pain, I'd invite you to find somewhere that feels neutral. Once you've found this place that feels most pleasant or neutral, the invitation is just to be with it for a few moments, noticing any shifts or ripples in sensation. And if at any point during this practice you feel tension or discomfort, you can just stop. But if this is feeling like it's grounding or reducing stress in some way, I'd invite you to notice what signals is your body giving you that demonstrates that this feels grounding or is reducing stress in some way. Some signals my body gives me can be my belly softening, my heart rate slowing, my thoughts becoming a little bit less busy. You might notice some of the same or maybe some different sensations. Just spending a couple more moments noticing what's arising for you. Okay, so I invite you to bring a little bit of movement into your fingers and your toes. You can open your eyes if they were closed, and maybe take any movement or stretching that feels good as you come back into the space. Okay. Well, thanks for trying that with me. And if you needed to do something else for your body, then thanks for honoring that. So, as has already been mentioned at the start of this digital gathering, we are really experiencing what some would call a polycrisis, multiple crises that are interconnected and entangled. And this includes the multiple genocides that are taking place against the Palestinian people and the Darfuri people in Sudan, but also the atrocities in Congo and Haiti and many places being impacted by Western imperialism and necropolitics. Alongside all of this and the general pressures of late-stage capitalism that many of us are navigating, hustling through to meet our needs, there's a weightiness to this time. And it can't necessarily be contained in neat or tidy ways. Much of this is spilling over into our daily lives and relationships. This kind of unraveling is very relational. So I say this just to acknowledge that it's okay to not be okay in this time. There is a heaviness, and as has already been spoken, a possibility. As much as there is deep suffering, there is what I think of as a kind of pulling back of the masks that have hidden some of the dynamics that have been at play for a long time when it comes to global power relations. And so it's a really entangled and full and messy time to be alive. At least that's how it's landing for me. But it is clear through all of this more and more what is not serving life, what systems need to compost. And in and amongst the unraveling, there are possibilities for that change to come through and to start growing, being cultivated more and more. But in the midst of all this change and possibility and pain, there is a lot of collective grief. Grief that is not just limited to an individual anymore, but is being held kind of by and through many of us. For me, it feels important to acknowledge that grief is not limited to the death of a loved one. I feel that grief can arise in our lives from so many transitions, whether this is the loss of our homelands, harms done against the earth and more than human kin, a loss of former versions of ourselves, the grief from the impact of state violence, the military-industrial complex, the grief of the ways that mental health systems, carceral systems, and abuse can change our lives, and the grief of healing or recovery tools not always being accessible in the current system. The general inaccessibility that so many of our disabled, chronically ill, and madkin are navigating in mainstream spaces. There's a lot. And there's a lot moving at this time, and there's a lot of grief that we may be feeling at different points, in different shades. And it's completely understandable to not have the capacity to feel all of that all the time. I certainly don't. What I do think can be helpful is for us to make space to acknowledge the grief that is there, that is present when it arises. And when we're safe enough, if we're safe enough, to make space to resource our bodies so we can gently feel into it, even if it's only for a few minutes, just to notice where it might be located and start to be in gentle conversation with it, building capacity to hopefully have more of a relationship over time at a gentle pace that works for us. I feel that with the times we find ourselves in, it would really be of benefit for many of us to cultivate a way of intentionally dipping in and out of our grief so that we can create more room, more space, more ease to be with these sensations over time, and hopefully move out of a cycle or a binary that I think many of us are in, of either numbing quite a lot of the discomfort and the grief that is present for us, or being completely flooded by it. I think many of us can yo-yo between those two states. And there's a whole range of gray in between. And it's this space in between that I think is helpful for us to start building capacity to have other ways of being with it without it being that binary of numbing most of it, most of the time, or being flooded. I would like to just uplift two ancestors who've really shaped the way I think about grief. And these ancestors are Sobonfu Some and Malidoma Some. And they are elders. They were elders. They're still elders. They're just no longer alive. But they're elders of the Dagara people who are indigenous to Burkina Faso and West Africa. And while they were alive, Sobonfu and Malidoma spent a lot of their time spreading Dagara grief rituals and other healing technologies in the Western world, because they really felt that we don't have much connection to grief tending practices in much of the West currently. And I just want to share a few of the kind of ideas that I was introduced to through them, which really resonate with me around grief. The first thing I want to share is this idea of grief being a generative force, something that's actually supportive for the web of life, something that's supportive for us to feel into regularly. And this is kind of counter to how we see grief in the West, where it's currently a taboo, where grief and death can be taboos, where we're kind of forced to deal with it on our own or isolate until we can become productive workers again. So instead of that taboo and that shunning of grief and death, these cyclical parts of our existence, in the Dagara context, grief is seen as something that's generative, that's helpful for the community. So much so that there is a monthly grief ritual traditionally where all Dagara people are expected to show up and tend their grief. And it's actually taboo to miss that ritual because there's a sense that untended grief will actually become harm in the form of violence or other social ills. So everyone is really expected to be engaging with their grief on a monthly basis, checking in, being in conversation with it, letting what needs to move and shed. There's also a sense of it having a spiritual rooting of grief practice and ritual being something that connects us to ancestral wisdom and helps us get clear on our gifts and what we're here to share in the collective, how we can support the web of life, or essentially what matters to us. And there's so much more I could say, but I'm going to keep it short for now. The last two things I'll share from Malidoma and Sobonfu's wisdom is Malidoma would speak in his writing a lot to this idea of grief practice or ritual being able to help clean out some ancestral dirty laundry. So the things that perhaps our ancestors didn't want to look at, didn't know how to deal with, that can often, in conscious or unconscious ways, pass down family lines. And in the Dagara context, grief tending is really a way to start to move some of that ancestral dirty laundry that is still in need of support. It's still in need of kind of clearing. The other piece I want to share before I move on is Malidoma would also speak to feeling that the lack of space for grief in the Western context is actually a form of social control. That when we're disconnected from deep feeling within us, when we're unable to access this kind of fuller range of sensation and emotions, that we're easier to manipulate and less connected to our agency. And less connected to what matters to us and what we're really intentionally moving towards. So all of these ideas really, really resonate with me and inform a lot of the ways I am developing practice with grief in my own life, but also in community. I really hope that we can, over the years, develop strategies and culturally contextual ways of being with grief in community. And I hope that the GEN Grief Toolkit and Tending Grief can contribute to that in some way. It is my deep, deep sense that communal grief tending can reduce isolation, the ways that so many of us feel like we have to be alone with our grief can really reduce that when we can be together in our grief, can help us to build trust and get clear on what we care about and what really matters to us and how we can start moving towards that together with other people. And there are rituals and practices you can check out in both the GEN Grief Toolkit and Tending Grief. But these things can be very intuitive and as simple as even just holding someone as they cry or being held while you cry. It can be as simple as that or more kind of intentional rituals. But I would just invite, if you are interested in this, to just notice what the longings are in your heart of how you want to be with this and allow yourself to follow that and experiment with that. So the next thing I want to feel into with you all is in relation to social change, and I think what may be on many of our hearts around how we tend to this moment, how we sustain the work, how we move towards the futures we long for. There's a lot of mobilization happening in this time and a lot of urgency. And I've been really heartened and touched by the student encampments, by the incredible organizing for Palestine, for people organizing around Sudan, solidarity, and what's happening in Congo. There's a lot of energy moving in this time to hold governments and corporations to account and try and dismantle these systems that are harming all of us. And I'm grateful this is happening. But given the scope of what there is to compost and transform, I sense that this is going to take time. Perhaps years, perhaps decades. Who knows? Maybe the work of our lives in some way, shape, or form. And with that, I have a nervousness around pace and urgency. And I feel that there's this paradox of urgency that I want to speak to. Because yes, the times are urgent. There's a lot to tend to, and there are many lives that have been lost, that have been taken, and others that are entangled in these systems. And at the same time, we have to be able to sustain this work and find ways to be nourished within it, to hold each other within it, to rest within it. And I don't know if the pace we're moving at in many of our movements in the West right now is allowing for that longevity. So I'm curious about what it would look like to take different shapes in our approach to social change, to learn how to create and grow new infrastructure, practices, and ways of being, as well as resisting and saying no to things, but really generating as well. Learning how to discern what a yes looks like and feels like to us, rather than just a no. I trust that we can do hard things and we can learn different ways of being, especially if we acknowledge what's not currently in alignment for us or what we can foresee may be troubling down the line. Sometimes we do need to move with urgency, 100%. But there are other moments where we need to be able to change shape under pressure. And what do I mean by that? Sometimes we need to practice patience and grounding, like the gorgeous offerings we've had the pleasure of experiencing. But what does that look like collectively, to collectively ground in movement or in groups? Sometimes we need to de-escalate. Sometimes we need to escalate. Sometimes we need to discern and have the courage and openness to build coalition across difference. There are different shapes that we're going to need to take at different times. And currently I see a dominance of one shape, this urgent, fast-paced shape. So I recently wrote a piece kind of exploring some of this on my Substack around fermentation and social change. And this was inspired by experiments that I'm doing in the kitchen around fermenting food. And so I'd been reading the book Wild Fermentation by Sandor Katz, which inspired me to write the piece. So I'm just going to read a quote from this book. The social change is another form of fermentation. Ideas ferment as they spread and mutate and inspire movements for change. Though fermentation is a phenomenon of transformation, the change it renders tends to be gentle, slow, and steady. Contrast fermentation with another natural phenomenon, fire. In the realm of social change, fire is the revolutionary moment of upheaval, desperately sought, or dreaded, or guarded against, depending on your perspective. Fire spreads, destroying whatever lies in its path, and its path is unpredictable. Fermentation is not so dramatic. It bubbles rather than burns, and its transformative mode is gentle and slow, steady too. Fermentation is a force that cannot be stopped. It recycles life, renews hope, and goes on and on. So reading this, something really clicked for me. That I sense that a lot of our movements, not all of them, but many are really embodying this fire energy, which is so important and necessary. But again, is one shape, is one way. And I sense there's also a need to be able to learn how to ferment change, to over time, systemically create shifts that ripple through generations, that change behavior, ways of thinking, that change culture. like deeply change culture. This work is much slower, and I feel that there are ways it can work in tandem with that fire energy, but we need to have multiple approaches, probably more than fermentation and fire. But this metaphor just got me thinking around what the embodiment of these states collectively could look like and ways we can start feeling into that. I'm really curious about what it would mean to commit to fermentation as a practice over the longer term. What would our rituals be? What would the ways of showing up look like? What are the gestures that support this approach? I honestly don't have the answers right now, but I'm deeply curious about being in practice, and I feel I am in practice and trying to figure it out with other people. And I do sense a few things that might be helpful in these journeys of experimentation. I feel there are lessons to learn from somatics, particularly political somatics, given that a lot of these methodologies really help us to embody change, to relationally live it with each other and change our shape over time. I'll put some links to some political somatics organizations that I learn a lot from, that I'm very grateful to, in case you all would like to check this out. And yeah, kind of deepen into, start practicing what that changing shape can look like on an individual level, but also collectively. Aside from somatics, I also feel that disability justice has so much to teach us. I have a lot to learn still, but particularly around care and access and how much that supports us to really be with each other and create the kind of infrastructure that serves life in the different ways, shapes, and forms that we exist in, the different needs that we have, and how we can really hold each other. I feel there are also lessons around fermentation from movements more in the South American context, and also indigenous movements for social change, where there are more pluriversal approaches. So approaches that are looking to create multiple worlds that can coexist with each other, which I think can feel quite different from the Western universalism that many of us are quite steeped in, even if our ancestral lineages come from other corners. I think that Western universalism can be kind of just something that's sitting along the surface of a lot of what we do. So for me, I'm really keen to continue learning from other movements outside of the West that do have this multiple worldview approach, as a way that we can, really be in building mode and coalition building with each other as we ferment and create culture change. So as I move towards the end of this talk, I do want to mention a resource that has really impacted me and something I continue to return to, because my shape as someone in social change has changed a lot in the last years. And there's been grief in that for me. There's also more and more trust. But the resource I'm referencing is the social ecosystem map, which I know will be talked about more throughout this event. It's a resource that was created by IDHA to highlight the various important roles we can take within social change work. Some of these roles include caregivers, healers, builders, weavers, visionaries, frontline responders, guides, and storytellers, just to name a few. And what I love about this resource is it acknowledges that there are so many different roles that contribute to social change, that are necessary for an ecosystem that supports culture change. And this kind of moves away from the very ableist ideas that there is just one way to be an activist and that that's always a frontline person who's using their body in a certain way, performing certain roles. That's not the case. And that kind of logic invisibilizes so many incredible disabled activists that have contributed in a whole range of ways that don't necessarily look like that. And it also highlights that many skills that might be seen as soft skills are really integral to this work, and the ways that we can show up for those of us who are introverts, who are disabled, mad, chronically ill, also are valid in the ways that we can participate if they don't look like frontline response work. And hopefully this can give way to more appreciation and space for the range of ways that we show up and the importance of all of our roles. And the fact that these can shift throughout our lives. They might not remain the same, and that's okay. A small example I want to give, I'm really heartened by a lot of the student encampments, as I've mentioned. And I heard recently from a friend that one of the encampments, they'd created a care coordinator role. And I thought, great, that sounds really different than when I was organizing more in my 20s. We never had anything like that. But then my friend said, oh, well, yeah, but the care coordinator keeps on going to all these actions. And so they're kind of too burnt out to coordinate the care. And I thought, oh, that's them. You know, the intention is there, but in practice, they're maybe not honoring the importance of that care coordination and still feeling like going to the front line, going to the action is more important than coordinating the care. So I just give this example to say that I do see some changes, but what would we need to have the courage to really practice honoring the different roles that we're in, even if they're not currently validated as what activism looks like in a kind of mainstream sense. And that's something I'm very much wrestling with and sitting with myself, because it's not easy to move out of that role if that's somewhere we have been, but it's so necessary if we're really going to support building an ecosystem and sustaining culture change and fermented longer term change. Noticing what roles we really have capacity to be in and honoring that, and finding ways to be with the feelings that come with that. The last thing I want to offer before closing up and passing on to the rest of the team for the next part of this journey, it's just something that gives me rest and respite in these times. And that's really allowing the seasons and the earth and the ancestors to really hold and ground me. And if that resonates with you, I would invite you to feel into and build relationship in the ways that make sense to you with the seasons and the turning of the year and any ancestors you feel in connection to. When I say the seasons, I mean moments like this, solstice, shifts in the cosmos, in the planet, in the seasons, which allow us to pause, to reflect, to notice what we've been in commitment to since the last solstice, what maybe needs to shed, what we maybe want to call in, and just allowing the earth and the seasons to also ground us and root us in these processes of reflection and commitment, shedding and intention setting. I think this is a way we can move away from purely cerebral approaches to social change, weave in ritual and connection with our ecosystem, with our home in more overt ways. And with ancestors, these don't have to be biological. These can be any people you feel in lineage and connection with. I think there's a lot that we can do by connecting with them, asking for their support, and seeing how their lives, their examples can feed in and support us in the moments we find ourselves. Asking, how we can find alignment, how we can rest enough to sustain what we're trying to offer. The last thing I would say as well is really an invitation to try things out with trusted people on a small scale. Adrienne Maree Brown's work on emergent strategy is so much about these fractal approaches and trusting in the small scale and how that can ripple. And so what is your version of culture change? What do you want to ferment? And who could you try that with? What could you commit to that would feel really good for you and speak to a longing in your heart? I think there is so much possibility to make space for the experimentation that will create the foundation, that will create the seeds and the plants that will grow into the infrastructure for the new worlds we're trying to live in and inhabit. But I think it will really take us being in practice and moving towards what we care about with intention. And I hope that we can all find the soft spaces we need to be with our grief in the midst of it all, to keep that moving so we can stay in alignment. Yeah, so that's it from me today. I guess as one final moment, I might just ask you to, or invite you to, just notice any sensations moving in your body or your mind. Maybe notice places where there's connection and support for your body. Maybe your soles of your feet against the floor, or your back against the chair if you're sat down. Yeah, just noticing how that's landing for you. Anything you might want to take with you, anything you might want to leave, it's all welcome. Yeah, thank you for being here with me, and yeah, happy solstice.